The following episode contains or may contain spoilers. So if you're spoiler sensitive, maybe beware.
Yeah, you sensitive people.
Get out.
No, get in.
Okay, I'm recording.
It works.
Yay. Okay, I guess I'll just start it because we just talked in the beginning and I don't know what else to say. Okay. Welcome to the Phantom Zone. 3 fans, 1 podcast, and a sea of comics. I'm Noah.
Kayla.
I'm Jared, and I'm surrounded by animals.
Well, there are worse things, I guess.
That's true.
That's true. You could be surrounded by snakes and
Or plants.
Badgers. Or,
Or supervillains.
or very true. I mean, I wouldn't mind that, but I won't get into that.
Oh, it's because Noah is secretly evil.
Secretly.
Yeah, he'd like learn tricks or something like that from the supervillains, like ways to further his evil.
Okay, today we have a interesting and special episode and something that we wanted to talk about. One of the type of characters in comics, and it's characters with disabilities. Yeah, and we thought, I don't want to say a niche character or even a trope, but they are specific types of characters, and some of them, their powers are related to their disability. Other ones, they're not really related to their disability. So then it, begs the question of, was that shoehorned in there, or is it necessary, or, that type of thing.
Yeah, well, can I start off top saying that I was personally offended when I couldn't do any of my top 3 favorite characters who happened to fit into this category, Professor X, Daredevil, or Barbara. They were like, no, you can't do those. Do someone else.
Hell yeah.
Well, because with those characters, we could literally do an entire episode. I mean, most characters we could do an entire episode on.
Exactly.
So
let me do my favorites.
Well, we did an episode about Barbara. I mean, or at least a lot of her. So go and listen to that, because we actually do talk about her disability a lot.
Whatever.
No, but I mean, bringing up Barbara, and I think she's a good example of, I remember Jared saying something about the revolving door of people with disabilities. And, they didn't have disabilities when they started out. And, she was paralyzed and she was in a wheelchair, and she became this amazing character, Oracle. Mm-hmm. She became a huge part of the DC universe, and everybody loved her. I mean, it showed that, just because she's in a wheelchair, she was able to do something else and still help people, and made a team. Mm-hmm. Made a team of some kick-ass women. But because comics, and when the new 52 came out, they decided to reverse it because there was magically some, operation that could be done to reverse it. I don't know. How do you guys feel about that? Like,
people were so offended when that happened, and I was one of them. Because, it just feels like, representation of all types matters so much in comics that to just reverse something like a physical disability, it just sends the wrong message. I don't understand the execs thinking it was okay to do that, especially because Oracle was such a beloved character.
Yeah, and she wasn't lacking in any way. And part of me really, I loved her as Batgirl, but I love Oracle as well. I thought she was an integral part to, the mythos of DC. And then they took it away for, I'm not too sure what the reason is. There's no short list of Batgirls.
Yeah,
or people
exactly.
that could beat Batgirl. So, and then also another weird thing with her is they made her younger with the new 52. So it's not only was she able to walk, but then she was younger. So it's just, the whole thing was weird.
Bad and offensive.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, and to keep in mind, is that like there's when we talk about disabled people, we're talking about a certain kind of identity, and that happens in comic books and comic book politics. That certain identity interests run in conflict with yet other identity interests. And I think we talked about in the episode, that's something to remember about the Oracle issue, is that it was a feminist position that said that she should walk again. And the argument, and this is Gail Simone who supported this number, so it's not just some sort of fringe sort of feminist. The argument was that women who are injured in media, and comics are no exception, are damaged for longer. And she had this, and often more traumatic, and it becomes more a part of their character than men who are displayed more resiliently. So with Batman, and again, this is just, we covered this more extensively in the episode, but he has his back broken by Bane. He recovers, he goes past it. So, I don't know. I think it's a complicated issue. I agree with Kayla, just as a fact. Like, I think Oracle is a fantastic character to represent the disabled. Remind of that, because it wasn't a kind of cavalier sort of, oh, it's better when they walk kind of attitude that brought her back to that. It was an argument about how women have, maimed in comics, and they were trying to combat that.
Well, I mean, I understand that point, but I feel like it would be better. Like, I feel like the solution was still insensitive to another group of people. I think the solution would have been to, if you are going to have disabled characters in comics, just leave them that way, and make them and write them interesting stories so that you don't feel compelled to fix them, quote unquote. I don't think the solution was to make Barbara walk again. I think it was to leave other characters of different genders and identities, disabled in some way for their representation, and, just write interesting stories around that.
Yeah, I would say tweet Gail Simone about it. I don't know. That's a good point you made.
I mean, she has said stuff. I love Gail Simone. I mean, I think we all love Gail Simone. But she's human, and people make mistakes, and
they can be wrong.
Yeah, and like I've seen her on Twitter say, she has talked about that because people have asked about it, because she's like the Birds of Prey writer. Like, everybody holds her up as like the best Birds of Prey writer, and especially with Oracle and everything. And it's weird because I wouldn't say it's necessarily flip-floppy, but I think she understands both sides of it.
Yeah. But
ultimately, she does support them, bringing her back, to be able to walk, ultimately for a feminist position, or for, what Jared was talking about. But I mean, I think both sides are right, and, both sides could be wrong in certain circumstances. But
Well, let's go back a little bit, because I think what's interesting too is that, just to point out what we're talking about with Batgirl, is that she was a disabled character, but that was later on in her character history, and it was certainly crucial to what her character would become. And those are the Oracle years are probably my favorite Babs years. But it's interesting to compare that to other characters who, from their inception, were disabled and identified as characters that were disabled. Because in some sense, this is just like this little piece of her history. Whereas you have other famous characters, and they happen to be your favorite characters. that
I get to talk about them now.
I think you should. And so let's begin with, I think, probably the most famous disabled character, which is Matt Murdock, Daredevil.
I love Daredevil. I mean, he was one of the first disabled characters in comics, although my guy that I ended up choosing for the spotlight he predates him by 20 years.
That is interesting.
Yeah, I actually didn't know that.
Fun fact, the more you know.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and I think, so with Daredevil, like, when I think about Daredevil and everything, I don't think of him as disabled. You know what I mean? Like, I know he is, like, if, we're doing this episode and we had to think about it and talk about it, but I think that shows you, and just with every other group that needs representation or is a different type of group or minority, like, if they're written well, if they're good characters, they're given proper places in comics and not to be strictly political or just to get, that, token kind of character in there. It's not going to be something that it's like, oh, this is Daredevil, he's disabled, and also this. You know what I'm saying? So, I mean, I think, Daredevil and like Professor X are some of the best examples of that. I mean, Professor X is a little like, he's always like, in the animated cartoon, it's like you have a bright yellow floating chair. It's like, it's right there.
I don't think it has to be invisible to be, like palatable, but I feel like.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think you make a good point in terms of like, it would be strange and offensive and obvious for that to be the only significant part of their character, and they're only there to be the token disabled character. But a lot of reason you wouldn't notice would because Daredevil and Professor X are essential parts in almost every X-Men plot, and Daredevil has his own comic, so
exactly.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I was going to say I actually think that excludes the notion of tokenism here, or at least it goes past it, because it would be one thing if it was sort of a team book and you had these sort of main characters and then they filled out the cast with a character that was disabled. But in the case of Daredevil, I mean, that's what the book's about. And I don't want to defend tokenism too much, but it's almost like it's the start you have to have, which is like I think it's a big thing that Marvel decided in the 60s, by the way, which was, not the zenith of progressivism, to have a character who, not just like happened to be blind, but that was a central part of who they were. Like, that's a big move, right. I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And it makes it like, even though he has this disability, I mean, it doesn't hold him back per se. I mean, some of his villains know that, and they'll do things to, counter his, what he lacks in what a normal hero would have. But I mean, it doesn't hold him back in any way. And I don't think people should think of him that way. Like, his disability holds him back, or like, because he has a disability, he's no more a hero than anybody else.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I agree with that for sure. The idea that he's no less a hero. I want to enter this into the discussion as a question, because I think there's this difficult thing that writers have to deal with in terms of writing disability, which is, okay, it has to be realistically depicted such that we're actually honoring the problem itself, but at the same time, we're talking about superheroes with powers, so they have to be powerful and have greater capacity and stuff like that. So I always wonder, when is the line where they have such superpowers that it's almost like they don't have a disability anymore, versus, when do you not empower them enough? So it's sort of like realism versus empowerment.
Well, the one that I think was done poorly, and too quickly, and kind of just, here it is and there it goes, was Rhodey from the MCU. I mean, he got hurt, which happens in the job. It's part of the job description. And yes, he's in an exo suit. He's in, an Iron Man type suit, and that would give him the ability to walk. But the fact that they went a step further and then use that technology to just essentially be like, that terrible thing that happened to you, and you still were able to be a hero, we're just going to take that away, because it just seemed kind of like a pointless plot for them to do that. Because what was the point of them doing that? It's like, oh, that was devastating. He almost died and everything like that. And then it was like, oh, by the way, I can just fix your legs real quick. So it's like, well, okay.
But that puts a certain burden on the story that maybe it didn't intend to carry, just in the sense that, we don't have character. Rhodey has an accident. There's a crisis. And, he essentially is fixed. I mean, it wouldn't be that different than him being in a car wreck and then, potentially being paralyzed.
That's what I'm saying, going back to the whole revolving door type thing. It's like, okay, you have this happen and then it just gets fixed right away. I mean, I know we're talking about fictional things, and there's, technology that doesn't exist in our world that's in that world, and they're able to use that. But then, it's just weird that where do they draw the line of being able to fix things? I think, being paralyzed or not be able to walk and those kind of, disabilities are the ones that are reversed the most.
I was just going to say, I feel like a lot of the issues, because I do feel like it is kind of a balancing act, because it's issues like, I don't know, violence against women or disabilities in comics. I mean, because that happens in real life. So, I mean, comics are supposed to kind of help people going through these issues, kind of see themselves in comics. So I feel like avoidance isn't the right way to go. The revolving door thing is obviously an issue. I feel like a lot of it would be kind of resolved if they employed either sensitivity readers to the target group that they're writing about, or I mean, just employing more writers that are, women or disabled or can speak to something like that. Because I do feel like it is a balancing act. There's no 100% perfect way of doing it. It shouldn't be not talked about, but it can't just be the only thing about that character. So it's complicated.
Yeah. I mean, that's pretty much what it is. And I think that's what it is with literature that is comics, because, it's a little different with novels and series because they're written and they stop. But with comics, they're ever changing, they're ever growing, they're continuing. There's characters that come in and out and, have disabilities, don't have disabilities, and they're created with them and they're not. And it's, us talking about this, none of us have, any disabilities or anything like that. So it's the only way that I can relate to this in a way is only because since, I'm part of the LGBTQ community, and recently I went to FlameCon, which is an LGBTQ, pretty much like a little geeky Comic Con type thing. And they really advocate for LGBTQ people with disabilities. So going to that thing, it was really awesome to see, people that are part of my community, and then also people that, you're usually given this representation in that community, a space to be there as well. I mean, there was tons of artists and cosplayers and everybody, people in wheelchairs or people with cerebral palsy and everything like that. It was amazing to see. And the only thing I could think of in comics with our LGBTQ episodes that we had, Jared and I can relate to those, and we talk about how much representation means to us. And it's amazing to see characters that it's oh, I know exactly what you're going through. You're writing something for me. And then to see kind of what they do with some of these characters with disabilities, it's well, I wonder how, that's affecting that community, or, is there enough representation? Because, just looking at the list of them, there's not too many. And, there's some that it even says in their bios and stuff like that, it's formally. You know what I mean? It's formally disabled, with most of them. So it's a weird thing. And it's, I guess, I don't know. I just have a hard time trying to talk about it in that aspect, because it's well, how do these people that are in that community feel about this? So.
Yeah, let me speak for them. I'm sure they'd like that. Here's the thing. No, not at all. But I want to make a sort of almost repeat point that Kayla makes a lot on this podcast, which is that when you start talking about how do they like to be treated, or what's the way that they want to be represented, whether you're talking about people of color or queer people or what have you, it almost presupposes the tokenism, which is, in other words, we're just going to have one and they have to speak for everybody. And it's well, the answer to this question is almost always have many, many examples, and you can express the diversity that you find in that community. So it's sort of there's a way that this is almost already solved. We just have to do it. And I think one question we can sort of talk through about it is this issue about how do disabled people feel about, and this is different from different forms of disability, but how do they feel about being quote unquote fixed? And the reason I mention this is that we have to be honest about the fact that, and I have a friend that's disabled that feels this way. You can see it in the deaf community, for instance. It isn't the case that all deaf people are just no, we will never be deaf. There's nothing wrong with being deaf, and I don't want to be fixed. Many deaf people get cochlear implants. And so, not just with Babs, but this idea of, can you have a character that's disabled that then comes out of disability? Is that appropriate? I mean, to be honest, that does speak for some of the disabled community. Some of them, if they had their wish, would have their disability cured. And that's a real question with science, I think, now with certain disabilities.
Yeah, I mean, and that's actually, that's a good point. And I can see how that, it's all fantasy, and being in the LGBTQ community, and, when I came out, it was terrible, awful with my parents and my family, and seeing stories written where there is a happy coming out, or the people are all accepting and everything. It's really nice to see. Is that reality? No, not for everybody. but it's still nice to see. It's some, it gives, either people hope or people that are struggling with that, or, it's like wish fulfillment in a weird way. But yeah, I mean, if the more you have with diversity and people with disabilities, the more stories and voices that can relate to particular people you're bound to have. I mean, most straight people can relate to straight relationships in comics, which are 90% of it. And then, most able-bodied people can relate to most comics. So, yeah, I mean, just add more.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to add here too. There's where there's good and bad approaches or exploring certain topics. The big thing is you have to write 3-dimensional characters that are really going through something. And I think it's fine if there's an argument about let's not, for the purpose of representation, sort of fix. And I put that in sort of quotes. Disabled characters, because we need to see them in comic books. But no matter what, you have to sort of show the sort of struggle that but that there's still heroes along the way. And I think it's worth mentioning, I like to see comic books where they're actually engaging with the disability. We mentioned Daredevil, and I wanted to stress, it's like he does have his senses enhanced, all his other senses besides vision. If you don't know, Daredevil is obviously blind. But there are plenty of situations where the fact that he cannot see affects him adversely. His opponents take advantage of it in certain respects. So they don't gloss over it with Daredevil, and I really like that. There are other characters where they do, and I'm curious the way to do this where you're not completely like ignoring the disability.
Well, I mean, I don't know. I mean, personally, only because I'm not a writer. I haven't really, unfortunately thought about that too much. But I mean, I think you bring up probably the best point. I mean, with Daredevil, or even with Professor X, and, even in the movies after he got paralyzed, how, he can't really do too much, if they kick him out of his wheelchair and then he's kind of stuck there. But I mean, when they show that, oh, this is part of them as well, and it's either being used against them or it's being used in their favor, I think that's the best thing they can do for that character. Because, I mean, if you just ignore it, then it's kind of like, okay, so why is this in their history? Why did you either make him have that accident or born this certain way if they're just never, I guess, going to talk about it or acknowledge it or act like it doesn't exist? I mean, I just think, like Kayla said, the best thing is it's a balancing act. You got to find certain ways to do it.
Oh, well, I actually have a side tangent that can totally go on. It's just a question, because I feel like one of the ways that it was handled really well, but I don't know because I don't read Hawkeye comics.
Mm-hmm.
I don't remember if he's still disabled hearing-wise, but he used to have to wear a hearing aid, and it was just kind of like a subtle thing. And I really liked it, and it was important to the disabled community, but I can't remember if that's still the case or if they got rid of that.
Do you know, Jared?
Yeah, he's still partially deaf. I mean, that's the character status. Any listener can correct me if that's been corrected, but I as far as I know, he's still partially deaf.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But yeah, see, not a big part of his identity, but also, I mean, it's just something that's people have to deal with, so he has to deal with this random issue.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that's good that you have this range of disability. And with our character examples, we're going to see a similar range of, the kinds of disabilities that, like you mentioned, are a constant sort of problem or obstacle, but that they live what most able-bodied people would recognize as a sort of, quote unquote normal life versus people who really the disability is, this tremendous hurdle every day, and they struggle every day with it, But I thought it was cool about the characters that we've been talking about too, about how central it is to their story, and that, thank God we have that. So Daredevil is a great example where it's just central that his blindness, and in a way where they even took this, I think before his character, almost little known or every once in a while talked about idea that when a person loses one sense, their senses get enhanced greatly. The Daredevil story is that on steroids, obviously.
Yeah.
And then, go ahead, sorry.
I was say not everyone gets special chemicals like splashed in their eyes.
Yeah, that's true. I have had that happen to me a couple times, and no extra senses. Just
a couple times.
Yeah, just eye burning, just deep eye burning. But
you just see, starbursts everywhere.
Oh, that's true. And then also there's characters like we mentioned with Oracle or Professor Xavier, where it's not just, that they have these powers and they have a disability at the same time. It's very clearly those things are dialectically connected. With Professor X on his inception, that was the concept. This person with a frail body, at least in terms of being trapped in a wheelchair, he can't walk, but that his mind is tremendously powerful. That's clearly, deep rooted in the concept. To a lesser extent, Oracle, where she loses the ability to walk, but she gains this other ability in information use and technology and stuff like that.
Well, see, that's the thing. Well, with Oracle, it's a little different. Only in that, I guess not a little different because she always had that. You know what I mean? Like she was always extremely smart, and I think that's one of the reasons. Not that I liked that she, was in a wheelchair or anything, but it showed that because she was a badass and she was fighting and she was a threat and everything physically. And then when she became Oracle, you really got to see that, this other side of her and that she, didn't just stand by or let, the grief of this disability consume her. She used her other set of skills. So, part of me is kind of like, oh, I really like that aspect of her. And I feel like it does come out sometimes now that she can, walk again and fight crime and stuff like that. But, it's put on the back burner. Obviously, they're more concerned about how many flips she can do onto somebody's face than, how many systems she can hack.
True.
And look, I'm sure there's a variety of opinions about how those characters that we've mentioned fit into the disabled community in terms of representation. And I'd love to read more about it if anybody has any suggestions. But I want to say, I think that they're relatively good examples. There are some bad ones too that are worth mentioning, and not just bad specific examples, but the whole communities, I think, that are being, almost virtually disrespected in comic book stories. I'm sure unintentionally, but, when you look up, what kind of disabilities are in comics, you see a few. Pretty readily. You see blindness, which I think we've mentioned has been people have dealt with well. You see different forms of paralysis, like quadriplegics and paraplegics and things like that.
Like Freddy. Sorry.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But the one that you see very often that I think is so poorly respected is amputation. People who have because in comic books, it is almost not an issue. They will cut someone's arm or leg off to make them look cooler. And they almost never deal with a disability. They lose the arm and then they just get this awesome hook arm or laser arm. I love Thor, as everybody who listens to the podcast knows. He lost an arm and immediately got different forms of magical metal arms, like he has one of the Destroyer's arm. It looks really cool, don't get me wrong. But I'm just thinking, if I was an amputee, how annoying it would be that, my disability is reflected in comics, but immediately dismissed and cured and almost fetishized, in this way where it's like, oh, look, it's an ornament. When you're, which is how it's treated by the artists, I think.
Well, yeah, it just seems like sometimes it's for shock value because, when Thor lost his arm, it was a big moment, and I remember reading that and I was like, "Oh shit, this is kind of intense." And then immediately it didn't matter. I forgot about it, and you don't notice that he's even missing it. It just looks like he has an armored arm on the other hand. So yeah, it all goes back to I just think if it's not an easy thing to write, or at least a normalized thing to write. It's a hard thing to write, especially if you're not part of that community, if you don't have the right intentions, or even if you do have the right intentions and it doesn't turn out well, like Wolfsbane representing the trans community did not go well. But stuff like that. It's just, I don't know. Balancing act. I think that's the best, Kayla came up, said the best thing. It's just the balancing act of it. or with any type of minority.
Just to underscore this point, I mean, I think it's the issue is, so you mentioned like Thor, and there's a bunch of characters, Aquaman too. There's an issue about it reflecting that trauma in comics. In real life, people are maimed in any number of accidents that range from conventional to much more dramatic. Look, I don't think that's wrong to depict. I think what becomes annoying about it, as a matter of fact, I'll suggest that some of those moments have been better handled than the afterward. And I think, like Kayla talks about this a lot, just the idea, it's like, you'll have, and someone will die in comics, but then there won't be a mature or prolonged exploration of that grief, which is what most of that experience is. And I feel like we're seeing a very similar thing with people who lose arms and legs or those sorts of issues where, they're being fetishized, they're being objectified. And, it's like, you don't want to take a community and use them because Aquaman's not selling well.
Right.
Yeah.
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 And I think the interesting statistic with it too is, I was looking up some reports. And, people in the disabled community actually make up a huge readership of comics as well. So, I mean, even just, because I'm in New York now, and when I went to that con that is specifically targeted towards LGBTQ people and also disabled people, I mean, it just even seeing that type of thing, I never, I don't think about that. That's just something that I don't think about. And then as we're talking about this and with our own personal experience in the comics, with Kayla being, a woman, and then Jared and I being LGBT, community, it is interesting to also be like, there is other groups that either are represented wrong or represented well. So
I wonder how Bucky and Misty Knight were taken, like how well received those characters were.
Right. Yeah. I mean,
Bucky's was a much more dramatic reveal and a much more dramatic thing, where Misty's, I think, was handled with a little bit more sensitivity, but it could be wrong because it's been a long time.
Right.
Since I've read that.
I mean, at least with those characters, and like you mentioned, especially Misty Knight, you didn't get the sense that they did that is some sort of cheap way of spicing up the character. Those were to various levels, intricate to or integral to who the characters were, or like with Winter Soldier, it really expressed that transition of being owned and turned into a machine metaphorically. So I think in some certain ways that was a well handled thing, at least, not insofar as it meant to be representative for the disabled community in any respect, but at least it wasn't cheaply written, and I think that
yeah.
Because just before we get on there, you're talking about the LGBT community and the disabled community, and that should come as no shock. I think that comics, because they always are interested in two major things, which is power, superpower is huge in it, ability, and justice. Communities that lack power, whether you mean in a physical sense, literally, lacking the power to sort of like be integrated in the community because they might not have wheelchair access, or you mean political power, there's women, people of color, queer people, comic books are going to speak to, if not your language directly, they're going to speak to subjects and issues that you're interested in. And so I think that that's, I don't want to be like, comics are specifically for disabled people. No, this is too big. Nobody owns it. But you have to admit, like, this is something that, it does matter how they're represented in comics more than, maybe other communities. I picked a character. I'll just say it's Jericho. Most from the Teen Titans, and I want to sort of say this beforehand, which is his disability is. He's mute. And I don't know, as it's also, it's specifically, I learned from, doing a little research, there are different forms of not being able to speak. Obviously, there's aphasia and things like that, which is usually more associated with a neurological issue. And that breaks down in many ways. Jericho has aphonia, which is, a form of muteness, when the larynx are damaged. They can be damaged, or they can be, there's different kind of diseases that can affect it and stuff like that. And I picked this because of I admit that disability in certain ways isn't as extreme as the the spectrum gets, right? I mean, there's, Jericho can still communicate, and we'll see as I talk about his powers that he's in many ways compensated for his inability to speak. But I thought what was interesting about talking about this is how conducive it is to the medium in comic books in terms of exploring it, right? Because with a character that can't speak, it means that all of the communication, all the expression has to be visually depicted. So it's not a thing they can really ignore, or at least when Jericho was exclusively mute. I'll talk about it in a little bit, how they've found ways around that. But when he was exclusively mute, they had to address it every time he interacted. And I thought that was a really cool thing, for the character. If you don't know, Jericho is a character, like I said, from the Teen Titans, and he comes out of a cool period in the Teen Titans because originally the Teen Titans were obviously sidekick characters that came together. But the success of the Teen Titans, and we've talked about this a little bit on the show already, came more out of the original characters that were created for the show. For the comic book. And, that was characters like Cyborg, Donna Troy, Starfire, these, characters that sort of like cemented it as not just this derivative thing, but its own, kind of institution almost, right? So Jericho's created after that happens. And he's, he was created exclusively by the artist, George Perez. So the writer, Marv Wolfman, really just kind of let that happen, took suggestions. So he's created almost whole cloth from that. And while Jericho can't speak, his superpower is he can possess others. His spirit kind of goes into their body. He can only do this with eye contact. Yeah, which is
that's pretty terrifying.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think I love that this character who already has pretty distinct, condition, they give him a relatively distinct power. It's not like that. I don't think this was the first example of it, but there weren't a lot of characters that had this specific power, What wouldn't you do with that power, right? Yeah, and I also liked that for the most part with Jericho, he can't... when he possesses another character's body, I mean, he generally gets their superpower or something like that, or what have you. But he can't speak unless they're asleep.
Right.
So yeah, it's weird, but I like that because it's sort of like, he doesn't just negate his disability instantly because he has his power, right? So I think that's super cool. To give you just a sense of his origin and why he's a little bit more important outside of just maybe being a kind of second stringer. In the Teen Titans, Jericho's the son of Deathstroke. And, his origin, yeah.
Worst father ever.
Oh, I know. And what's really amazing about him is he is not his father's son. And in a lot of ways, they wrote him to be the opposite of his dad, where Deathstroke is calculating and cunning and cold and other words that begin with C. Jericho is kind and empathic and caring and he's also gay, or at least bisexual. But anyway, and I actually forgot about that when I picked him. But anyway, but so what the reason his origins take root not just with Deathstroke, but in Deathstroke's origin himself. If you know the character, you'll know that one of the things that happens is that his a rival assassin known as the Jackal kidnaps Slade Wilson, aka Deathstroke's family, and to extort him into, I think, giving up a contract, essentially. And rather than do that, Deathstroke hopes that his superpower reflexes will he'll be able to save his children. So one of the assassins, one of them has the knife to Jericho's throat. Joseph Wilson is the real name. And Deathstroke, rather than just capitulate even momentarily to those demands and giving up his employer, he tries to save his son. He does, but not before his larynx are at least damaged by the knife. And there you get this character. And again, I think he's this really cool addition to comic books for a number of ways. Even if the disability is central to his character, they've filled him out in a number of robust ways. Like I said, one, the power is original, cool, fills a certain niche, and also he has this sort of full character. I think he's, so yeah, I think he's really, really cool.
Yeah,
I like him. I want to read more Jericho.
I'm interested to see. I know Kayla's going to love this part of the conversation, but
I know where it's going. I'm already loving it.
She's going to sign off. Because the Wilson family, the Deathstroke family are going to be in the new Titan show coming up. So, well, I'm curious. It's weird because they've showed Deathstroke and they showed Rose, Ravenger, but they haven't showed Jericho yet. So I'm interested to see kind of what's the secret behind him. And then also if they're going to, because you know how they usually change things for like TV shows or different adaptations, so like how their powers are used, or, if they can only use it during a full moon, but now they can use it, only at noon and then with a full moon. So I'm kind of curious if they're going to like keep his, powers and how they're used in the parameters that are with him.
Well, and another reason they may not be showing him is that and I'm glad you mentioned this, is that Jericho's has been involved in stories where he's possessing people, and the rest of the characters involved don't know it.
Don't know it. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so there's a famous story, I really like it, where Jericho possesses Deathstroke, and Deathstroke attacks his own team. Deathstroke attacks the Teen Titans. They just think they're being attacked by Teen Titans, but he has a weird message at the time. He's like, I'm going to kill you kids to show you that kids shouldn't be involved in hero fighting or whatever. It's too risky. It turns out Jericho was possessing his own father, and in this weird distorted way, trying to like scare them away from, to protect them or something like that. But that was a crucial part of the story where you didn't realize that Jericho was actually the one changing the character's behavior. I wouldn't be surprised if they do a similar reveal in the show where, somebody starts acting weird and then you find out later on they were being possessed.
Yeah. I mean, that's a really weird story, and that's a really weird reason on why Jericho did that.
It definitely was. And I think if you wrote it in a linear way, it would almost make very little sense.
Yeah.
But because it was written in this almost like more mystery sense, like why is Slade doing this? Why is he acting like this? Where is this coming from? There was a certain intrigue to it. And I think they won't have to do the same story, obviously, and I doubt they will, but it'll still be cool to get to see him, because like the funny thing is in cartoons, when people do this power, when there's possession, usually you see like a green spirit, kind of like a ghosty thing move into the character they're possessing. It's easier to depict in that way. When they do it in Titans, they're going to have to really do it through acting. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And exposition, so that'll be fun to watch. But last thing I'll say on him, and then we can move on. I think what was almost unfortunate, though he's a really interesting character in the latest Deathstroke comic book. One of the things that saddened me a little bit was that they used a kind of technological means to just give him almost like Stephen Hawking level talking, which is kind of a form of erasure. Even though, like, again, I love Christopher Priest's version of his character. It makes him like, they write him like, oh, what if your dad was a psychopath? How would you turn out? And you get to struggle with it. But I will say, I do hope where we get a little return to form of him dealing with muteness, I think.
All right. So I chose to spotlight Dr. Midnight. Yay. His first appearance was DC Comics. All-American Comics number 25. It was back in 1941. And I know I mentioned this up top. It was a long time. He was the first superhero in comics to exhibit any sort of physical impairment, predating Daredevil by 20 years.
That's crazy.
So I know Dr. Midnight's been around for a very long time. And then there's kind of three main people that have carried the mantle. The first one, and the one that I'll be talking about, is Charles McNider, Beth Chappell, and Peter Cross.
His name with his superhero name is just like, okay, we get it.
I know. Charles McNider. But anyway, and Peter Cross, who is the most current Dr. Midnight, he's kind of never had his own solo run. There's an exception that I'll talk about at the end during Rex. But he's kind of never appeared as a solo protagonist. He's always just been a part of the Justice League, kind of in the background. I'm guessing his number would be like number 37, 36. He's kind of down on the list. But rundown of his abilities. He has perfect night vision. He is a surgeon and a mathematician. He's an expert at hand-to-hand combat, but in this world, like what superhero isn't an expert at hand-to-hand combat, really? He has blackout bombs, very aesthetic, and he has a sidekick, an owl named Hootie.
I love it.
Me too.
So he has appeared in a live-action thing. If people are watching, which I don't personally, but if they're watching Legends of Tomorrow, Dr. Midnight's appeared there, and he will be appearing in Stargirl.
Yes, I'm so excited.
Yeah, look out for that.
But just real quick, I was going to say, the blackout bomb's such a cool thing. Really hasn't been...
I know.
It hasn't been copied that much.
I love it, too.
And you said he has the owl, and I just think it's cool. Also, you can see in his costume that he's sort of designed like an owl a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. He's kind of circular lenses.
Yeah. Very cool.
I like the aesthetic.
Mm-hmm.
So kind of a little bit of a rundown on his backstory. He was a surgeon helping a witness who was very injured but about to testify against a mobster. Mobsters find out where Dr. Midnight is, or McNighter, sorry, he hasn't become Dr. Midnight yet. And the mobsters throw a grenade into the room that he was assisting the witness. And it kills the witness and it blinds McNighter. So he's like taken to the hospital. He's in recovery, of course, classic bandages around his head. And he hears something crash into his window and fall into the room, and he's freaking out. And I guess by instinct he unravels the bandages. It turns out that it's an owl, but this is how he realized that he could see, but only in complete darkness. So his blindness kind of works, and if there's any bit of light, he's not able to see, but in complete darkness he can actually see. So that's kind of an interesting take.
Yeah.
It's like he's using his weakness against he's reversing it. He's putting them in a condition where he himself is the truly sighted.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. That's why I think the blackout bombs are so neat. But he developed a visor to kind of help him see in light. Plus, like you had mentioned, the blackout bombs help him fight if the visor becomes an issue. Some of the highlights on his kind of story throughout comics, like I said, he's kind of always been in the background. Not a lot of major things happened to him. One of his love interests, Myra Mason, it was back in the 40s too. So I guess they were like, oh no, because it doesn't work out well. They're like, maybe we shouldn't give this guy any more love interests. But he was murdered by a villain named the Shadower after McNighter's identity was revealed. It's like a lesson to all as to, keep your friends and loved ones far away. Another kind of fun fact is he helped deliver Peter Cross, who becomes Dr. Midnight later.
Mm-hmm.
And then he was actually killed during the event 0 Hour. I feel like I choose a lot of characters who are killed during 0 Hour for
That's
some reason.
true. This is number 4 for you.
I know. I don't do this on purpose. It's just I read it and I'm like, oh, of course. But he and the Hour Man were aged to death by, I think it's extant.
Yeah.
That was horrifying.
Yeah, it's really sad.
Yeah, and he's seen briefly again, but as a reanimated Black Lantern in Blackest Night. So...
Hey, I mean,
Yikes.
At least he's with the aesthetic. He needs complete darkness. It's great. He's doing great.
Yeah. He's never really left the dark aesthetic, I guess. That's a comfort.
Yeah, he has more zombified potential than most characters.
Mm-hmm.
What I thought was funny when you described that is just I didn't realize it was a grenade that was responsible for his blindness. I didn't know it was a bomb. And which is funny because he ends up using them as a weapon just in like darkness, like he was inspired. That's just a fraction away from like he was bitten by a radioactive grenade and got the power of grenades.
Or owl. It could have been an owl,
I think Hootie is obviously one of the most appealing parts of the character. So
yes, I actually really I can't like overstate how much I have always liked his aesthetic and the way he looks. Like even just the colors, it's very original. Like even just the way the costume is set up, it's amazing.
He really is. I think it to his credit, like, again, he's kind of a C-lister. He's not really in the forefront of comics in general when he was alive. But his aesthetic and just like the cool, I don't know, it was just like his look and his abilities was enough to kind of garner attention, even though he was kind of just, in the background.
There's also something great about these characters where it's like their origins are that just inspired by whatever vermin or critter like flew into their like domicile, like like Batman with the bat and apparently him with an owl. Like we're just lucky there's not a character called Human Possum, who like has like 8 baby versions of himself that he carries on his back and hisses at people to fight crime.
Stop calling out my type.
We already have Squirrel Girl. Like it's getting there. We'll get Possum Man soon.
We'll do this.
We'll make it up. Yeah. All right. Well, yeah, that's Dr. Midnight.
Yay! I'm super excited for him to be in Thurgo. Yay! Oh man, I like how both of you guys picked characters that are about to be in like TV shows and stuff. And
oops.
Yeah, I didn't. So I picked Maya Lopez, who is Echo. I feel like she deserves more page time. So she's been in and out of a lot of things, but I just think she's so interesting. So to get to who she is, so she's a Native American, and her dad is pretty much employed by Fisk, Kingpin. She's part of a mob family, and Kingpin ends up killing him, or at least puts the orders in to kill him. And the scene where you find out about that's where her symbolic face print on her face comes from, because when her father died, she was there and his bloody handprint went on her face. And so she's carried that on through her entire, career as Echo. And her disability is she's deaf. She's completely deaf. And growing up, she was put into, special needs schools. But when Kingpin had, sent out for her dad to be murdered, he saw potential in her, because she has the same exact powers as Taskmaster.
That's terrifying.
Yeah, photographic reflexes.
Yes, she has photographic reflexes. So she just has to watch something and then she can do it. So, it's especially interesting with her because she's deaf. And when Fisk kind of takes her in and like raises her, he puts her in like the best kind of schools, and they're like performing arts schools. So if you look at her power list, so the first one is essentially like, no, she has Taskmaster's powers, but then you keep going down and it's all performing arts. It's like expert pianist, expert dancer, expert, puppeteer.
Oh, she has my like dream list of abilities.
like she could, get like, not just be a superhero, but actually like get a job with like her abilities.
Yeah.
So
if anything, they just took what was already kind of implicit in the power set and then just was like, what if we did it for more than just fighting?
Exactly. Yeah. And so since Fisk being Fisk and Kingpin being Kingpin, he sees that he can use this to his advantage to get at Daredevil. So he pretty much makes this plot to send her after Daredevil. So he makes her meet Matt, before like not, going to kill him, but just to kind of get close to him. And this is after Karen Page had died, sadly. I think I talked about that in the Death in Comics episode. So long story short, Maya and Matt actually start a relationship, which is kind of sweet. But Maya wasn't informed that Matt was Daredevil. So when all goes down and Kingpin essentially orders her to kill Daredevil, she finds out that Matt is Daredevil and finds out the truth.
Why is all of Matt's girlfriends trying to murder him?
Right? All the time. Like, like, give the man a break and give these women a break. Like, stop making them kill each other. So once he finds out that, you know, the person that's trying to kill him is Maya and they find out who each other are, Matt explains to her what happened with her father, because Kingpin lies to her and is essentially like, oh, this is the guy that, you know, killed your father. And I think it's really cool how what she does to fight Daredevil. So one of Daredevil's arch nemesis, Bullseye, she watches videos of Daredevil and Bullseye fighting and then uses that against him. So Daredevil is super confused when he's fighting this new person that fights exactly like Bullseye.
Yeah.
But after she finds that out, she goes after Kingpin and she temporarily blinds him. And then she leaves and goes to her father's reservation in Canada, and guess who's there? Wolverine. So,
oh my god.
Yeah, she's intertwined with so many different characters like Moon Knight, Luke Cage, Wolverine, Daredevil, all these different characters, but yet she's always put kind of on the back burner a little bit. And that's essentially her origin. She does become Ronin. So she's actually the first person to be Ronin before Hawkeye, which I think a lot of people might not know, because usually when people think of Ronin, it's Hawkeye. But it was actually Maya. And then another, I guess one of the biggest stories with her is during, so Ronin and the New Avengers, and then the Skrull, you know, Secret Wars and all that stuff, or Secret Invasion, is she's actually Maya's killed as Ronin by Skrull Elektra. And Elektra resurrects her with dark magic and tries to brainwash her into joining them, essentially. But Luke Cage stops that, and then Luke Cage reverses everything, and then they go back after her, and then they end up killing her, and it's revealed that she's a Skrull the whole time. So, so yay!
Wow.
Yeah, it's been complicated.
Yeah, very complicated. And it gets even more complicated with the Moon Knight story that I can't even, it's hard for me to even explain that one.
You put a lot on the table. I actually think there's a few things worth sort of mentioning real quick. One, the Ronin thing. I'm glad you meant, just for the listeners, that people don't necessarily understand. Ronin ended up being, Ronin was never a character. Ronin is more like this mantle or a costume that various characters have been. Like you mentioned, Hawkeye was Ronin. Echo, of course, was Ronin. But also just in the Ultimate Universe, Moon Knight's one of his personalities was Ronin. So it's more just like a really cool look that they're always trying to fit somebody into.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think it's really cool because whenever she goes back to the tower after all this, the Avengers Tower, when all is said and done with, one of these big story arcs, it's revealed that, Hawkeye had her Ronin costume and he tries to give it back to her and she's like, nah, you can keep it. She's like, I'm done with that.
She's like, I actually look better than the costume already, so I don't really need that.
Yep. And then one more thing with her. So during the whole Moon Knight and Echo, they were in a relationship as well. And long story short, she's undercover. It's during the Skrull invasion. She's undercover in Los Angeles, posing as a stripper. And then Moon Knight comes in there and is attacking the people that she's trying to go undercover with. And then they end up joining forces to take down Kingpin's mob battalion in Los Angeles, I guess you can call them. And then she's killed again. And Moon Knight, goes into his Wolverine personality and then kills the person that killed her. And then years later, she's resurrected and acted in as if nothing happened. So she's been put through the gamut quite a bit.
Yeah, there's something to mention about here. You were like, oh, she always ends up in these other people's books. She appears a lot. There's a reason for that, and it's because she's really fucking cool. And so writers have wanted to use her in their stories because she really was a stroke of genius, I think. But I'm pretty sure Brian Michael Bendis created her. And I think she's one of these characters. That's why I wanted you to go to last. She's one of these characters that when she blows up, and it's going to be in a big way. She's one of those characters you just know, like, oh, she hasn't been adapted. She's one of those characters that we just haven't seen in TV or movies yet, but they're going to get to her, and she's going to be really big because she just has a great story. She's inherently interesting. What a cool look. And I wanted to also, I don't know if you guys noticed this, her power photographic reflexes, she ends up being that power always, any character that has it seems to have a disability. I don't know why that is. I just want to say Taskmaster has anterograde amnesia. Maya has, like you mentioned, is deaf. And then there's this character, Finesse, who is autistic, who has this power. So it's just interesting the way that they've always coupled it with a counterbalancing disability.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I really like her, and that's why I pretty much started talking about her as they need more of her, because not even just her aesthetic that I think looks really cool, and the handprint on the face, it's usually white, it's a white handprint on her face, is really striking. It's iconic for her. She's a threat, and she's a badass, which she proved when she was Ronin. I mean, she was the first person to ever be Ronin. But the only thing I'll say about her is that she falls into that trope. I mean, she was part of, Ronin and the New Avengers, World War Hulk, The Secret Invasion, Moon Knight, but almost all of those stories end with her dying and then being brought back. So it's like, okay, you guys want this character in it, but why do you have to kill her every single time? So, I mean, I hope they fix that.
And you mentioned, I don't think you mentioned it on the show. You mentioned this off air, which is just, we should, because it's rare, unfortunately. She's Native American, like you said, and that's just not you don't see that a lot in comics. Mm-hmm. And don't get me wrong, I know you mentioned that she's a Native American. What I mean is that, like, just the fact that, like, she's a double header in terms of representation.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, she represents a lot. I mean, she's a woman. She's Native American. She has a disability. I mean, she's. I mean, I like her. I want her more in stuff.
That's our wish for all of our spotlight characters.
I mean, pretty much. All right, comic book recommendation time. Kayla, you want to do yours?
Yeah, sure. So I'm going to recommend Dr. Midnight's only solo run.
Oh, you got it easy this week.
So it's called Dr. Midnight. There's only 3 issues, so like I said, a very limited run. It came out in 1999. The art is actually really good for the late 90s, guys. And it actually doesn't follow Charles McNider, the original one that I was talking about. It's about the third Dr. Midnight, Peter Cross, and it's about how he became Dr. Midnight. So basically he's trying to get these like weird steroids, like this new type of steroid off the streets. He's caught, and they inject the doctor with a very, very heavy dose. And he gets into a car crash. He's left blind, and that's when he vows revenge. But don't be too disheartened if you were looking forward to reading more about Charles McNider, because Peter Cross also has an owl companion, and he names his owl Charlie in honor of the first and original Dr. Midnight.
Oh, that's so sweet.
Isn't that nice? Yeah, so pick it up.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so I will do one that I didn't really talk about as far as in her story, because I did it on purpose, so that way you guys would read it. So it's the New Avengers Secret Invasion, and this one has to deal with Doctor Strange's Sanctum Sanctorum being destroyed, and involves Iron Fist, Skrull Daredevil, involves a lot of stuff, and it actually puts Maya in a very, internal struggle position, because the Secret Invasion is kind of just beginning, and she doesn't believe it happening, and then the choices she makes does not work out for her. But it's a really good story. I would highly recommend it. It's by Brian Michael Bendis. He's the one that wrote it. So,
oh, nice.
Yeah, New Avengers, Secret Invasion, Brian Michael Bendis, echoes on the cover. It's great. All right, Jared.
So mine is Teen Titans Volume 3. It came out in 2003. It's a huge team. It's Jeff Johns and Mike McKone, and that was before Jeff Johns really, I mean, he was around and he was known as amazing, but he wasn't the master of comics that we know him to be. But it's the story I mentioned, and I probably did spoil it, so I'm sorry about that. But it is just really well written and very interesting, which is again, story.
It's totally worth reading. I mean, most of the time, even if we talk about the stories that we do recommend, we're not telling you everything, and it's different to see it. Like, go look at the pictures and stuff.
Well, that's true, but just in this case, you kind of shouldn't know that it involves Jericho. But it is, but it is such a big moment. I like the one I mentioned where he possesses Deathstroke. And it's just the first, that series goes for a while, but you could do the first issue involves exactly what I'm talking about. So I would just say start there and you're going to get into the story anyway, and you're going to love it. You're welcome that I let you know about it.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Thanks for listening. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter at The Phantom Zone Pod for more podcast updates.